appalled at how quickly the salient had been overrun. Ludendorff was depressed to the point of a nervous breakdown. 200 square miles of French territory had been liberated, and the Americans had badly dented the German sense of military superiority. But in retrospect, for the Americans, the Battle of Saint-Mihiel was in many ways a meticulously well-planned, enormous live-fire training exercise. The Meuse-Argonne offensive would be something else entirely, and that brings us to the main point. So I had to do a lot of setup there to get to the Meuse-Argonne. Colonel George C. Marshall, operations officer of the First Army, had a fortnight to get nearly 1 million tons of supplies and 4,000 guns, not to mention more than 600,000 men, to their new positions above Verdun for the Meuse-Argonne offensive. It was, as one historian has written, the biggest logistical undertaking in the history of the U.S. Army, before or since. Units were regrouped after the Battle of Saint-Mihiel and rushed onto inadequate roads that were bogged with mud, jammed with masses of men, machines, and horses, clogged by accidents, and patrolled by military police who desperately tried to keep the traffic moving and stop the hot tempers of frustrated drivers. All movements would have to be at night if there was any hope of secrecy. Artillery took priority. Units had been held in reserve at Saint-Mihiel were next in line. They were moving to the front, and then the combat units that had crushed the salient. The Americans succeeded, with the help of the French, in moving this giant armada of men, machines, and supplies into position. Even Marshall was left wondering how in the world this gigantic mass was moved in the face of so many complications. The doughboys arrived to confront what First Army Chief of Staff Colonel Hugh Drum called the most ideal defensive terrain I've ever seen or read about. Nature had provided for flank and crossfire to the utmost, in addition to concealment for German defenders. Major General Hunter Liggett, commander of the First Corps, on the left side of the American line, faced the Argonne Forest, was put in mind of one of the most famous battlefields of the American Civil War. He said, "The region was a natural forest besides which the Virginia wilderness in which Grant and Lee fought was a park. It was massed and tortuous before the enemy strung up his first wire and dug his first trench. The underbrush had grown up through the German barb and rabbit wire, interlacing it and concealing it, and machine guns lurked like copperheads in the ambush of shell-fallen trees. Other machine guns were strewn in concrete pillboxes and into files. On the offense, tanks could not follow, nor artillery see where it was shooting, while the enemy guns on the defense could fire by map. Patently, it would be suicidal to attack such a labyrinth directly. It must be pinched out by attacks on either side." Liggett only had one consolation. The Germans considered their defenses in the Argonne so formidable that they garrisoned them with second-class troops. Pershing's goal was a drive north to Sedan, a distance of about 40 miles. Throughout the sector, bordered by the Argonne Forest to the west and the Meuse River to the east, the doughboys would be fighting over ground that the Germans had held and fortified since 1914. The German defenses centered on 3 east-west ridgelines, along with defensive positions on the heights of the Meuse, which was partially forested high ground running north-south behind the Meuse River, where the Germans stationed most of their heavy artillery. The Americans had one advantage, and that was that Ludendorff expected an attack at Metz, the attack Pershing had wanted to make following up on the American victory at Saint-Mihiel, rather than the one Foch compelled him to make at the Meuse-Argonne. But whatever hope Pershing drew from the Germans having only an estimated 5 divisions in the sector was tempered by the fact that the Germans could rapidly reinforce the area. They'd even built rail lines that could rush troops and supplies to the front. Pershing's staff estimated that within 3 days, these 5 German divisions could become 20, with 4 of them arriving in the first 24 hours, and there were many more divisions in reserve that could be called into battle, so the 20 could be nearly doubled. So some thought Pershing would be lucky if he could get 5 miles north of the Americans' current position in 3 months. A French liaison officer told Major General Robert Alexander, commander of the 77th Division of the First Corps, which would have to fight in the Argonne Forest, "Sir, I have no doubt that your men are brave and that you have made every preparation that will give them a chance for victory tomorrow. But permit me to say that, in my opinion, the German line in your front will not move. It has been in that place for 4 years, is solidly established, well wired in, and the Boche is a good soldier. I fear that you will not be able to make the advance you hope for." And Alexander replied laconically, "The line will move." Pershing's audacious plan was to blast ahead faster than the Germans, and Pétain and the French liaison officer thought possible. He'd sacrificed numbers in the interest of speed, choosing 9 divisions for the initial assault. He gave his commanders a first-day objective of a heavily defended ridgeline that was part of the Hindenburg, or as the Germans called it, the Siegfried Line, which was meant to be impassable. It was 10 miles to the north, 5 miles deeper than Montfaucon, the fortified mount of the Falcon that Pétain thought Pershing might need 3 months to reach. Pershing planned simply to storm it on his way to the strongest part of the German defenses, the Kriemhilde Stellung. He trusted to determined commanders like Alexander, and that his doughboys would make up in spirit what they lacked in experience. On September 25, 1918, at 11 p.m., the American artillery exploded. Among the artillery commanders was a creatively swearing Captain Harry S. Truman. The doughboy infantry had been given no warning in order to maintain secrecy, and sleepers got rude awakenings. Some troops cheered the astonishing flash of lights and the explosions that marked shells hitting home on German ammunition dumps. Others quavered under the roar, or were torn to pieces by German artillery firing in response. Under the lightning of the guns, the men were hustled into positions past withdrawing French troops, 220,000 of them in total from the French Second Army, who had held the trenches awaiting the Americans' arrival. The Americans leapt into the Meuse-Argonne Valley at 5:30 a.m. September 26th, piercing a thick fog made thicker by a covering smoke barrage. Commanders were under orders to press the advance and bypass German pillboxes and machine gun nests that couldn't be reduced immediately. The first objective had to be Montfaucon. It blocked the center of the American advance and was the high point of the Meuse-Argonne Valley. The French had failed to wrest it from the Germans in 1914 and 1915, but Pershing and his staff believed it could be taken quickly, counting on surprise, artillery, and air support. Tanks were also on hand if they could handle the terrain, but they were very rickety at this point. And they also had to rely on American fighting prowess. Pershing was so confident of the superiority of his American troops, he devised an attack timetable fit for the army of supermen, as one historian described it. The so-called supermen were organized into 3 corps, with Liggett's 1st Corps having orders to sweep the Argonne Forest on the American left. The 5th Corps, under Major General George Cameron, was given the task of taking Montfaucon, and on the right, the 3rd Corps, commanded by Major General Robert Bullard, would advance along the west side of the Meuse River and protect the 5th Corps' flanks. The American commanders thrust forward Pershing's trident. On the left, 1st Corps had a battle through the treacherous terrain of the Ardennes, but did reasonably well. On the right, 3rd Corps made good progress, not much stymie by German resistance. The crucial point was the center of the line, and here, Montfaucon didn't fall as easily as was hoped. Cameron's 2-pronged attack on the objective started well, but as the morning fog lifted, German machine guns and artillery pinned down both sides of the assault, which was entrusted to the 79th Division, a majority of whose men had been in the army for less than 2 months. The American troops hard charged and briefly occupied the town, but they couldn't dislodge the Germans from the boot of Montfaucon. With that, Pershing's hope for a bold start was squelched. The German commander of the Meuse-Argonne sector, General Max von Gallwitz, noted that the attack appeared uncoordinated and led by inexperienced troops. He was confident he could turn them aside and remained suspicious that the attack was really a feint. The doughboys might have been inexperienced, but they made good for their commanders by noon, September 22nd, taking the boot of Montfaucon, even if they were then cut off and had to survive 3 days without supplies. All along the American advance, even where it had gone well, the friction of war and the fog of war had fallen. Troopers and generals got lost. Traffic jams of artillery and men, including evacuated wounded, clogged the muddy roads. The delay of Pershing's plan was costly. German reinforcements rapidly stiffened the defenses the doughboys had to breach, and the Americans found it impossible to break through the Kriemhilde Stellung. On September 29th, Pershing had to concede that his great lunge plan had failed. He called a halt until he could bring up veteran reinforcements. Okay, so here comes the big push in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Pershing was fighting the biggest and costliest battle in American history. By the battle's end, which was the end of the war, on November 11, 1918, 1.2 million American troops had been involved, 1/10 of them were casualties, and more than 26,000 of them were dead. Pershing had an enormous task in front of him, and that was doing his not inconsiderable part in rolling back the Germans from France and winning the war. New divisions were brought up, units were reorganized, and orders issued. Pershing's army went back into action on the morning of October 4th and found the Germans waiting with reinforced positions and showers of artillery shells raining down from the heights of the Meuse. Against a storm of steel and lead, the doughboys set their helmet straps and trudged forward. But artillery shells and bullets can stop, or at least slow in advance, more effectively than rain and mud. So Pershing ordered the French 17th Corps, which included an American division, to suppress the German guns on the heights of the Meuse with a direct assault. In the west, in the Argonne Forest, the 77th Division had a similar task, to find and suppress the big German guns, but it had to fight amid a large, dense, tangled forest that effectively cut regiments into their component parts and was spiked with German machine gun nests, snipers, and blockhouses. It left some troops feeling, not for the first time, as if they were reliving their ancestors' experience of Indian fighting, though the Indians in this case were equally or better matched and had high-power weapons and better discipline. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. The landscape itself was sobering. If Belleau Wood was Hell Wood, as soldiers called it, it was a small corner of hell compared to the Argonne, which, as one American tasked with its conquest wrote, was a bleak, cruel country of white clay and rock and blasted skeletons of trees, gashed into innumerable trenches and seared with rusted acres of wire, rising steeply into claw-like ridges and descending into haunted ravines, white as leprosy in the midst of that green forest, a country that had long ago died in pain. Some of the pain was a sewage for the troopers when they found abandoned blockhouses laden with unimaginable luxuries, including a piano, a wine cellar, and other signs of how well supplied these long-standing German positions had been. The doughboys took a few bottles into the security of their packs, but they had to be careful because some abandoned German dugouts were booby-trapped, and their orders were to continually press forward. Now, let me get in here to the Lost Battalion, which the questioner originally asked about. The orders and the brave spirit of the doughboys led Major Charles W. Whittlesey into an action that earned him the Medal of Honor. Whittlesey, 34 years old, a battle commander of the 308th Infantry, was, in civilian life, a New York lawyer and graduate of Harvard Law School, notable for his round spectacles and gentlemanly demeanor. Pressing ahead in the Argonne Forest, he was twice cut off by the enemy. The first time his men were without supplies or reinforcements for 3 days. On October 2nd, he was leading another advance into the Argonne. Whittlesey had a reputation for coolness under fire and aggression that sometimes showed itself in sardonic humor, but he was not a cowboy. He thought the attack he had been ordered to make was suicidal. But, after delivering a formal protest, he did his best to execute his orders. He had the nickname Galloping Charlie, which he'd earned for his quick march, staying true to his moniker. His was the only successful attack that day in the Argonne. His battalion was a cobbled-together unit made of 6 companies of 308th Infantry, 1 from the 307th, 2 from the 306th Machine Gun Battalion, all from the motley 77th Division, a melting pot division from New York, with replacements coming from western states. His objective was the Charlevoix Mill Road. When he reached it, his men dug in on a slope facing the road and formed a defensive perimeter. He sent word to his regimental commander that they had taken their position. Whittlesey had advanced well beyond any units covering his flanks, but this was in keeping up with Pershing's order that units of the 77th Division should push ahead without regard of losses and without regard to the exposed condition of their flanks. Pershing refused to slow his timetable either to accommodate the lack of progress by the French, who were supposed to assist in the attack, or in deference to the difficulty of communicating with units in the Argonne. The best course was to press ahead. The success of Whittlesey's advance, however, was more notable at division headquarters than it was on the patch of land occupied by the men. They were short on rations, short on ammunition, short of medical supplies, ring-fenced by enemy mortars, and surrounded by German troops. 2 companies of men were missing, and attempts to find them only led to more casualties. Division Commander Major General Robert Alexander, sensing Whittlesey had made an advance that should be exploited, dispatched an infantry battalion to reinforce him. Only 1 company of that battalion made it, and it confirmed for Whittlesey not only that he was surrounded, but that the Germans were tightening the noose, stringing new wire and planting new machine gun nests. Whittlesey's second in command,